So I'm just outside Massachusetts General Hospital at a location up there, I think you can kind of see it, called the Ether Dome. That's the location of the very first anesthetized surgery done in the world. Sort of. The story usually goes that a guy named William Morton put a guy under and another surgeon cut open the neck. And that was the first surgery. But here's the thing, it's way more complicated than that. Welcome back to another medical history video. My name is Patrick Kelly, and it's been a while since I've done one of these. I've missed it. So whenever we read history, our brains like to make things tidy and clean cut, and that's the kind of thinking that gives us great man history. Usually you'd see this kind of history in high school classrooms when you're learning about wars and politics, but scientific history is guilty of the same thing. So to understand why William Morton gets so much credit for this enormous moment in medical history, we need some context. The idea that a chemical could reduce pain wasn't new by any means. Other than alcohol and opium, which have been around forever, chemists have messed around with all kinds of concoctions for a long time. The chemical that we're interested in today is sulfuric ether, first synthesized by German scientist Valerius Cortis in 1540 by mixing together sulfuric acid and alcohol. He called it sweet vitriol, because you could get away with naming chemicals cutesy stuff like that back then. Cortis noted that his mixture might have medicinal properties, but he died at age 29, so he didn't get to explore that much further. And once modern chemistry and modern naming conventions took over, his sweet vitriol became sulfuric ether, or sometimes ethyl ether. And ethers as a group are everywhere. Structurally, they're really similar to alcohol, so you can get stuff like methyl ether, which is just morphine, sulfuric ether, so on. Fast forward 200 years, and an English surgeon named Matthew Turner recommended ether for headaches, whether you wanted to mix some in with your wine or just snort it. So that means even by the 1700s, we had an idea that ether had medical uses. And around that same time, another drug called nitrous oxide, or what you might know as laughing gas, was getting popular outside of medicine. Before anyone noticed they took pain away, they realized that laughing gas and ether both got you high. People would inhale rags soaked in ether or suck on balloons full of nitrous oxide and have a good old-fashioned ether frolic. Now, yes, sometimes this looks like a Victorian-era house party, but oftentimes it was actually college professors who would show off nitrous oxide at the end of their classes. And at one of these laughing gas demonstrations in 1844, one unlucky participant gets really badly injured. Or so everyone thought. While everyone's getting high on nitrous oxide, one guy hits his leg really badly and falls to the ground. And when everybody's going to check on him, he's fine. He's not in any pain at all. And one of the men who saw that in person was a popular Boston-based dentist named Horace Wells, and he immediately made the connection. See, surgery and dentistry were in a weird spot back then. Not only was there not yet anesthesia, but operations were done with brutal-looking 19th century technology, and the probable infection after surgery was lethal. After witnessing laughing gas's potential to eliminate pain, Wells volunteered as his own proof of concept. So he had his assistant give him a hit of laughing gas, and while he was unconscious, extract one of his wisdom teeth. When he finally came to, he had no pain, he was out one wisdom tooth, and he was ready to bring nitrous oxide into his practice. So over the next few weeks, Wells used laughing gas for 15 of his patients and decided that he was going to be the one that brought anesthetic surgery to the public. And he would do so on the biggest medical stage in the country, Harvard University. And y'all, it went terribly. He was originally scheduled to give laughing gas to a man who was about to get his leg amputated, but for a few logistics reasons, that couldn't happen. Had he pulled that off, instant credibility. Instead, he stays around and does a guest lecture. He talks about how great laughing gas is and about how much success he's had within his dental practice, and then he calls on a volunteer from the student audience to get a tooth extracted while they're under the influence of laughing gas. And can you imagine how bananas that is? Like, a guest lecturer comes to your college class, claims that this party drug is going to make pain go away, and then tries to pull out one of your classmates' teeth. Unfortunately, Wells didn't give his volunteer enough nitrous oxide, so this poor kid is screaming in agony while Wells is yanking on his tooth. Obviously, this is super embarrassing for Wells and ends up being a permanent scar in his professional career. So not only would he not get into the history books, but his own apprentice would take the exact title that he was after. This is where William Morton comes into the story. It's not totally clear how he and Wells started working together. By 1843, they opened a dentistry practice together in Boston, but soon afterwards they dissolved their partnership so that Morton could go to Harvard Medical School. So they had a pretty brief partnership, but they still kept up on each other's work. Remember that for later. Now, Morton wasn't a particularly good student at Harvard, but he took classes by someone who would be really influential and the last important character in our little trio here, Charles Jackson. As was tradition at the time, Jackson would end his classes with a laughing gas demonstration. One day he didn't have any laughing gas on hand, so he was like, well, we use ether to get high in the same way, so let's try it out. On some students. What the heck were these professors doing back then? So Professor Jackson takes some ether and puts it on a towel, has a student inhale, and the student passes out. Jackson, of course, is panicking because he's like, I just killed a student. Luckily, that student woke up shortly afterwards, much to Jackson's relief. From that moment on, Jackson talked about ether in his chemistry lectures, but he never did surgery. But guess who was listening to those Harvard lectures? A young William Morton. By this point, Wells had already tried and failed at laughing gas surgeries, so Morton thought that ether would make for a more effective anesthetic agent and thus be the thing that made him a fortune. So he began a literature review and then experimentation shortly afterwards. He gave ether to his dog, and it worked. He realized he was onto something huge. So the plan was to keep things as simple as possible until he could make this grand demonstration and cash in on the discovery. When it came time for human experimentation, which just meant himself, he did the same thing. Took a rag, soaked it in ether, inhaled, and saw if he lost consciousness. And he did. So he recruited 2 medical students and tried to replicate it on them, this time with less success. Both of the participants got drowsy, but neither of them lost consciousness, or what doctors at the time called insensibility. Morton concluded that the regular ether you'd buy at the apothecary, the drugstores at the time, were too contaminated with alcohol. He ran into another problem, though. How to administer ether. The old rag method was clearly not very scientific. So he had a buddy make some custom glass pieces which he fashioned into some of the first ether inhalers. He tested the purified ether on himself and, again, success. He knocked himself out for 7 to 8 minutes. Plenty of time for a tooth extraction. So for the next few weeks, Morton administers ether to his dental patients with varying degrees of success. So now that Morton's got some anecdotal evidence, he decides to go for it. And it was at this room in Massachusetts General Hospital that it happened, the famous ether dome. So Morton got in touch with the head surgeon at the time, a guy named John Warren, and he's like, hey, I got this substance that knocks people out, and you've got some surgeries to do anyway. Is it cool if I try it on them? And Warren's like, yeah, okay. Were there no lawyers back then? The lucky guinea pig was a 21-year-old Bostonian named Edward Abbott, and he had come in for a vascular tumor in his neck. Basically a big jumble of varicose veins under his jaw and neck area. So Morton put him under, Warren sliced open his neck, removed the mass, and sutured him up. And when Abbott woke up, he said he felt no pain. That was October 16th of 1846, the day referred to as Ether Day. And it's usually why credit for anesthesia goes to Morton. Now we could end the story there. Anesthesia had been discovered and the steady progress of science would deliver anesthesia to the rest of the world, right? Nope. This is where it starts to get good. The surgeons at Massachusetts General knew that Morton was onto something here, but they also knew that if they had something that could alleviate suffering, they had an ethical responsibility to share it. Now, Morton knew that if he gave up his secret recipe, he wasn't going to be able to bank in on it, which makes Morton the Victorian-era Mr. Krabs. He added a little bit of an orange scent to regular ethyl ether and attempted to patent it as Lethion, named after a healing river in Greek mythology. Now, the other doctors suspected that it was ether, but they didn't know if he had added anything in or what the case was. Either way, on November 6th of that year, Morton spilled and revealed that it was sulfuric ether. This was after he had tried and failed to patent this thing excessively. But Morton still had the monopoly on those inhaler devices. So after realizing that ether was about to be everywhere, he took out a ton of money from the bank and rushed production on thousands of ether inhalers. If he couldn't charge for ether, at least he could charge for the device. It took just a few weeks for news of ether's discovery to reach Europe. So by November of that year, London-based dentists and surgeons were using ether in their surgeries, one of which was a dude named Robert Liston. I'll come back to him at the end of the video. Now, depending on what you think of the whole situation, this next part is like the tragic downfall or the righteous justice for William Morton. Things seem like they're going great, despite plenty of arguments from both Jackson and Wells saying that they deserved credit for the discovery, plus a guy named Crawford Long who claimed that he did the first anesthetized surgery back in 1842. Morton won. He got credit for the discovery, and because he couldn't win his patent battle, he got to claim that he was a selfless public benefactor now. No, literally, he titled his autobiography Trials of a Public Benefactor. So by early 1847, Morton had shot his shot, but he hit an unintended target. He wasn't able to cash in on ether, but as long as ether was getting popular and his inhalers were being used, he was still making money. But that wouldn't last for long. Not even 3 months after Ether Day, a Scottish obstetrician named James Simpson introduced chloroform into surgery as an alternative. See, ether did not smell that great, and chloroform had a much less abrasive smell, but it was much more dangerous, killing 1 in 2,500 patients, while ether killed 1 in 25,000. As chloroform got popular, less dentists and surgeons used ether. But Morton's real death sentence came from the inhaler. As more clinicians adopted the inhaler, they started realizing a huge design flaw. See, there was a little valve that required the patient to breathe deeply and fully in order to let oxygen in. Not doing so would drown them out in ether. And obviously it's hard to breathe deeply when you're unconscious. So on March 26th of 1847, Mason Warren, who was a friend of Morton's who worked at Massachusetts General, started using, get this, a sponge instead of an inhaler. That sponge almost instantly took over in doctors' offices and replaced those fragile inhalers. And it's just such a good twist to the story because Morton tried to bamboozle everybody at first with this common drugstore chemical and then upsell them on these expensive inhalers, but in the end, it was a simple sponge that worked best. After investing so heavily into those glass inhalers, a simple sponge put Morton in financial ruin, but it also made for an explosion of accessible anesthetized surgery. All a doctor needed was a sponge and some ether, and they could make the pain go away. Unfortunately, it took another 40 to 50 years of experimentation to really dial in metrics like dosage and best practices. One doctor in the journal Anesthesiology claims that this era of practice didn't end until 1904, nearly 60 years after Ether Day. Basically, because the first anesthetized surgery was done recklessly quickly, it would take another few decades before anesthesiology would become a more precise science. More administration devices would be invented, and the use of multiple drug agents became more popular than single drugs like chloroform or ether. Like one drug to eliminate pain, one to induce amnesia, one to suppress reflexes, and all of it was precisely monitored and adjusted to minimize side effects. The rise in popularity in anesthesia made surgery more popular, which in turn improved surgical skill overall. But it also highlighted the key missing piece of the puzzle. If we want to go deeper than surface level incisions, we have to do something about these infections. Luckily, a handful of surgeons over in London would be uniquely set up to solve that puzzle in the upcoming years. One of which was Robert Liston, who I mentioned earlier in the video. If you want to hear the story about how anesthesia led to the first antiseptic surgery, click on that video there. I want to give a sincere thank you to my patrons on Patreon. Their financial support is what allowed me to buy a ticket to come out to Boston and film parts of this video. So if you want to join them, you can click on that link right there. Have fun, be good. I'll see you next time.